Hello y'all, this is Louie and welcome back to Retrosaurus. Today we'll be examining how player control affects the intensity and effectiveness of horror in video games. As games have developed and evolved throughout the past 3 decades or so, one thing has always been a sticking point when it comes to player enjoyment: controls. It's not uncommon to hear someone ask for an example of the gameplay that a new title may have to make a mental comparison, or play a demo of something that piqued their interest to get an idea of what the game is. Control, not that one, is so fundamentally linked to how someone enjoys a game, it's really hard to fault someone when they argue against a game's quality based on their experiences. Some games benefit from loose, floaty controls like one of your silly physics-based indie games, while others want a fine-tuned, tight control scheme for a competitive fighter or shooter. Interestingly enough, some game genres benefit from more constrictive control schemes where the player has less direct control over their character or elements of the game. Horror specifically seems to hinge on this idea that less is more with controls, as it's very easy to slip into the action genre if too much control is handed over to the players. In order to fully understand the concept of controls in regard to horror games, we're going to examine the cult classic and pinnacle of survival horror, Haunting Ground, while making a case of why this game in particular deserves a proper revival for a modern audience. Haunting Ground, known as Demento in Japan, is a survival horror adventure game released on the PS2 and developed by Capcom of all companies. Believe it or not, but this game actually just turned 15 years old this April, May for us in North America, and is actually contemporary with another well-known Capcom classic horror game that has been ported over and over throughout the years to every piece of hardware that can run it or can't. But unlike that one, Haunting Ground has never really seen the light of day again after its initial release. Interestingly enough, it actually shares some development history with Resident Evil 4, but ultimately is seen as a successor of sorts to Clock Tower, another classic horror series that Capcom had a hand in developing, albeit very briefly. So why has this game been seemingly forgotten by its publisher since its release? What makes it so unique and memorable that it warrants a return? Although both titles were created by the same company and occupied the same genre, they couldn't be any more different in terms of scope, gameplay, and design. As many of you may be more acquainted with the Resident Evil series, and there even is another video on this channel that goes into more detail about it, hint hint, I won't go into too much detail about that series in particular until the need arises. Haunting Ground, however, marks the first time this series has appeared on Retrosaurus, so I'll take a bit more time to go into its origins. To make it brief, after a lengthy explanation of why I don't want to have a lengthy explanation, Resident Evil is an action horror series with focus on gunplay and inventory management. Simple, boom, done. So before we begin our dissection of Haunting Grounds proper, we need a little background on this game. Haunting Ground was developed by Capcom and is considered a spiritual successor to the Clock Tower series of sorts, but only unofficially, as Capcom does not own that license at all. Although they did have a hand in developing Clock Tower 3, the rights to the IP were retained by Sunsoft to this day. Clock Tower is a unique series within the horror genre, first appearing on the Super Famicom of all places. There are only 4 official entries in the series, though only the first 2 games have any relation to each other, and the Super Famicom version does not have an official English translation, although there is a very good fan translation available online. There have been games that attempted to revive the series spiritually, with Nightcry in particular being helmed by the original director of the series, and another evolving into Remothered and becoming its own distinct series. I'd say there's at least a Clock Tower in every game, but Ghost had bucked that trend, and Clock Tower 3 simply had one in there for the purpose of a really cool cutscene. It's almost an anthological series if you think about it, as most entries follow a new protagonist with a new story and only thematic connections and similar gameplay design. Though vastly different between entries, there are mainstays that appear in each game. Each title stars a female protagonist, usually in their teens, and contains supernatural elements with a focus on exploration. Furthermore, every Clock Tower game barring Clock Tower 3 features multiple endings to give players more replayability and a reason to argue with each other within the fandom as to what is and what isn't canon. The gameplay of Clock Tower is one of the many hallmarks of the series, with each game featuring point-and-click or adventure gameplay, panic-based gameplay systems, and perpetual stalker enemies that make you feel like you're never truly safe. Stamina also plays a huge role in the player's ability to perform actions and movement, and is even directly linked to your health bar. No stamina, no life. This is where the panic systems come into play, but they differ game to game. In Clock Tower SNES, PS1, and The Struggle Within, also known as Ghost Head, mashing a certain button would allow the player to do things such as break away from the stalker enemy or perform an action. In Clock Tower 3 and subsequently Haunting Ground, panic returned in the form of a meter that would fill when scared or attacked by an enemy. Once the meter was filled, you'd be sent into panic, where control and movement becomes less responsive. Get hit again, and you're dead. There is no direct combat in a majority of these titles, opting to encourage players to hide from enemies or use environmental hazards to slow their progress and give you some breathing room. For some reason, Clock Tower 3 added in Sailor Moon inspired boss fights, but let's just ignore that for now as the game is truly the oddball of the franchise. Like its contemporaries in the genre, there is item management and puzzles to force players out of hiding to make progress while Scissorman or Woman hides in wait to corner the player. The games are similarly light on direct guidance for players, leaving them to wander about and discover areas and items to interact with, almost like an old school Sierra adventure game but with more logic and less pay-by-the-minute phone calls to some hacker at a desk to explain that you need to use the chicken on the skeleton to distract the scorpions and take the key. God, I really wish I was making that up, but that is a solution to some Indiana Jones game. Anyway, given its development alongside fellow Capcom classic Resident Evil 4, it almost feels like they intentionally made them polar opposites to test the waters before moving forward with development in the genre. This was around the time where Resident Evil was kind of on a downslope after years of basically the same game over and over again, so they wanted to see what would work and what wouldn't at this point. The games released roughly 3 or 4 months apart back in 2005, but by the time Haunting Ground had arrived, RE4 had become the new hotness. The shift towards action and placing more control in players' hands became the norm for not only Resident Evil, but even other AAA and established franchises. Heck, eventually even Silent Hill shifted towards combat-heavy gameplay and focused less on their stories, starting with Silent Hill Origins, a series that was otherwise known for its psychological horror and deeply disturbing stories. Although I would argue the series was dead in water after Silent Hill 2 released and set an unbeatable standard. Get it? In water? Silent Hill 2? Shut up. This, coupled with Capcom sadly not promoting their new IP nearly as much as they should have, resulted in abysmal sales despite some critical praise. Surprise, Capcom did nothing and was surprised by the outcome. News at 11. Due to the low sales and lack of marketing, copies of this game have become hard to come by, with disc-only copies selling for over $100 minimum in North America nowadays. This makes it even more desirable for a revival, as its name is constantly brought up in horror fan circles with few ever having played or seen it. But what really made it so undesirable when it was released that would make anyone want to see its return now? One could even make the argument that Haunting Ground felt too dated and too obtuse for players in 2005. Comparing it to its predecessor side by side, it felt too similar to Clock Tower 3 with entire systems being repurposed and reused. Though I will argue that the gameplay is far more refined and interesting in our subject. If you break it down, their narratives are also vaguely similar. Recently orphaned teenage girl gets into a bit of bother caused by her uncle grandfather being quite the creep. Essentially it's the same game, they both even feature a sidekick that follows you around like a little lost dog. But on a serious note, the games have distinct thematic differences that make Haunting Ground one of the most disturbing games in the PS2 library. I'd love to talk in detail about the story, but I'll keep it limited to its relation to gameplay as that is our main focus here. That being said, the thematics and story of the game are deeply tied into the gameplay to enhance its effectiveness and keep us away from the game journo buzzword, ludonarrative dissonance. To keep it simple, ludonarrative dissonance is when the story or thematics of a game conflict with the gameplay. A good example of this would be Spec Ops: The Line, a game whose narrative attempts to tackle the darker, human side of war, then features a competitive multiplayer mode. To many, this is not an issue, but for some this can make or break the immersibility of a game. Thematically, Haunting Ground is about abject helplessness and lack of control. Everything from the story to the gameplay, right down to how the players interact with the environment and control the characters. Everything hinges upon making the player feel like they have limited to no control over the events that transpire. Even with directly controlling Fiona and not simply guiding a cursor like in the original Clock Tower games, you still get the feeling that you're only suggesting actions and hoping Fiona will oblige. Now, there is an elephant in the room with this game that I need to address that does veer into content warning territory. At its core, the narrative of Haunting Ground and the themes and tones surrounding it do heavily feature sexualization and assault of women. Fiona is presented as a passive, weak female protagonist, notable especially in the opening moments of the game where she is seen encaged, covered merely in a white cloth. From the get-go, Fiona's body and agency are handed over to the player, making you responsible for her survival. The various stalkers who haunt the Belly Castle are eager to get their hands on her body for their own personal agendas. This is where the assault and objectification themes are felt the strongest in the narrative, and are meant to pair with the gameplay to really hit home that you are not in total control. And with that, the disturbing results from your failures are meant to make you feel guilty and uncomfortable. While I do think the game is effective in marrying the narrative to the gameplay, the problematic nature of the game cannot be completely hand-waved and is understandably open to criticism. Fiona's gameplay is coupled with your AI canine compadre, Huey. Like most dogs, or at least my dog, you cannot directly control their actions, but with some training they will begin to learn simple commands. Or not, like my dog. Huey takes quite a while to build up his trust, so early on your commands are often met with an adorable while simultaneously infuriating head tilt. Even in the late game where you absolutely need Huey's help to progress, he will sometimes choose to ignore commands completely, and it is infuriating. And I really need to stress that you absolutely need his help through most of the game, as there is an ending that occurs if you choose to abuse Huey, which causes him to leave you alone in the castle and ends the story. This pairing of a player and a non-human NPC makes for a unique experience compared to other survival horror games. There is a sense of grounding the game in reality without being overly realistic, if that makes any sense at all. I cannot understand why developers lean towards realism in most video game genres, but for horror it makes almost no sense. Why in the name of heck would I want realism in a game about zombies, mutants, and monsters? And at that, I am tired of every heckin' AAA game taking the cinematic film approach that just recreates scenes from established films with little to no substance, only to get our brains to go, oh yeah, I know that thing. It's lazy and it cheapens the medium, and as someone who doesn't like movies, I'm so over it. Oh god, where was I going before this? Some of the issues with the AI can be hand-waved with hardware or engine limitations, but we've come a long way with AI in games in recent years. However, many horror games since Haunting Grounds, even more specifically Capcom games, look, we have an ongoing theme here, have opted to emphasize multiplayer in the place of learning or capable AI partners with questionable results. The Resident Evil franchise went on a huge multiplayer binge starting with Outbreak File 1, continuing through 5, 6, and finally ending, I hope, with Revelations 2. Now, whether or not you hold these games in high esteem, it's nearly objectively true that horror games lose their edge in multiplayer situations. Furthermore, the more control a player has, the less tension and fear can be felt. I'm going to specifically target Resident Evil 6 with this one, as that game features insane maneuverability and control that pushes it completely into the action movie game territory. And when you're not doing godlike flips and dives while gunning down gun-wielding zombies, you're watching a cutscene and mashing some buttons. Now, this was the standard for horror for such a long time that it was unthinkable for something like Haunting Grounds to resurface, especially in the AAA gaming space. Many big-budget horror games began to rely on cinematic sequences and continue the action heaviness with big hitters like The Last of Us. Really, when you think about it, the entire first wave high-definition console generation is filled with overly cinematic games that did very little to make the video game medium more than an imitation of movie and films. From the start of this current console generation, that's the PS4, Xbox One era, as this video will age worse than my one day I decided to be a Pokemon speedrunner, things started to change, both in the indie scene as well as the AAA front, that gave me some hope that the winds of change were blowing in horror's favor. Now, we absolutely cannot talk about modern horror without bringing up one of the most influential pieces of video games media in the current console generation, PT, aka the proof of concept demo for the ill-fated Silent Hills reboot helmed by Kojima. This game crops up time and time again in listicles whenever someone mentions horror or influential games this generation. And honestly, they aren't wrong. PT really was one of the few games that really creeped me out, though this was well before I got into horror games. Sadly, this is not a game I have access to, as Konami has long since pulled it from the PlayStation Store. When it came to PT, less definitely was more, and I will repeat that phrase ad nauseum until I have ingrained it into your psyche, so do not bother to tell me that I overuse it. I don't care. The game features a first-person perspective with absolutely no guidance for the player. You repeatedly walk through a looping hallway as things begin to change randomly. These ideas echoed some ideas seen in titles such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, but in a more effective manner, at least in my opinion. But the hallmarks of effective horror are there. Simple but restrictive controls, lack of guidance, and that eerie feeling that something is watching and stalking you through the hallways. And you can see these ideas with some change and personal flavor added in yet another Capcom title, Resident Evil 7, but specifically the demo. After release, it was updated and patched with small changes over several months to build up hype for the new game. Horror had finally returned to the slower paced mystery it had long abandoned during the PS2 era. Blog and forum posts spread throughout the internet saw players gather to piece together optional and hidden secrets in the demo to unlock the true nature of the upcoming game. Now, if we only knew what to do with that mannequin finger, I mean, after playing RE3 Remake, I have some ideas of where Capcom can put it. The horror genre has also seen a resurgence in popularity of perpetual and instant stalker type enemies. Alien Isolation brought us a learning AI stalker in the form of the titular alien, who would adapt and adjust your gameplay style throughout your playthrough, forcing you to try new tactics to outsmart this formidable foe. The xenomorph is unkillable, so you are incentivized to use stealth and the environment in place of simply plugging in shot after shot. Shortly after, Resident Evil 7 found great success with Jack and Marguerite Baker, with the remakes of 2 and 3 featuring a redesigned Mr. X and Nemesis to keep the players on their toes. Indie games similarly found some success with the walking simulator and adventure game genres, where less emphasis was placed on combat to bring exploration to the forefront. A spiritual successor of sorts by the name of Remothered was initially incepted as a remake of the Clock Tower series, ultimately finding success through Kickstarter, and soon will be releasing the second game in a planned trilogy. Horror is still a niche genre in the grand scheme of things, but it's clear that the shift away from the action-heavy horror games of the previous generation is showing that developers are being more experimental and willing to make smaller-scale games to revive it. As companies such as Capcom have been looking at their previous works for remakes and revivals, there is a chance we could see the return of Haunting Ground in the form of a remaster not unlike Devil May Cry or Onimusha before it. They even have announced that they are working on a new horror title that isn't Resident Evil nor Dino Crisis, so my hope is not completely unfounded. At the very least, we can see the ideas from it and its Clock Tower predecessors appearing in more and more horror titles. Even with its faults and its problematic nature, I still feel like Haunting Ground deserves a second chance to show a unique take on a genre that is typically only found in even more niche Japanese indie horrors like Corpse Party. Fans are hungry for a return to form and for more effective horror that doesn't shy away from disturbing or mysterious subjects, so it's not unthinkable that there is a demand and interest for Haunting Grounds, or at least an inspired title. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's the desire to experience Haunting Ground in some way, shape, or form. Find a video of it, find a stream of it, you can even get it in Japanese for fairly cheap. There's only English voice acting in it and no English text, so you'll need a guide, but it's still worth buying. Just somehow, someway, find the game, experience it, and let Capcom know that you want more. Alright, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Retrosaurus. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, if you'd like to support this series, it is supported entirely through Patreon. There's a link in the description, or just search the website for KyoryuHunter and you'll find it quite easily. Now, I have an idea in mind for the next episode this month, so keep an eye on my social media and maybe even join my Discord where I'll announce it. But you can find me all over the internet at KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. Now, if you're new, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell for alerts. And if you really liked it, smash that like button and tell me in the comments what you thought. And once again, my name is Lou. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time on Retrosaurus.